Chapter 1 of Broken Plea is written by former FBI agent Christopher Whitcomb, and it opens with the butterfly effect, the idea that one small movement can trigger consequences much larger than itself. And honestly, that feels like exactly the right place to begin, because this chapter is not just about the first officer on scene. It is about the first flap, the first moment when the raw scene, the written report, and the story that would eventually form around this case start to separate. Because in a case that ends with a plea, the earliest layers matter. Not just what happened, but how what happened was first recorded. Hi, my name is Stina. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. Today, I'm starting a chapter-by-chapter breakdown of Broken Plea, the new book written about the Idaho 4 case. And I want to be upfront about my approach. I'm intentionally not reading ahead. I want to take each chapter as it comes. What we're told, what gets emphasized, what gets left out, and how certainty starts to form. So this is not a book report, and it's not me trying to solve the entire Idaho 4 case in one video. I'm looking at layers. The raw layer is the body cam. The official layer is the written police report. And the book itself adds another layer of framing because the author is also choosing what to highlight, what to contrast, and how to arrange the information. So in chapter 1, I'm not just asking what Officer Nunez, the first responder, saw or did. I'm asking how the first human reaction to chaos became one of the first official versions of this case. To me, chapter 1 is about one major pattern: the authority of the first record. A first responder's report may not be the final investigation. In fact, it usually isn't. But it can still carry enormous weight. Because once something is written down officially, people tend to treat it as a stable fact. Future steps can start building on it. Future narratives can start leaning on it. And that becomes especially significant here because, according to the author, Nunez's initial report was later used as part of the early investigative foundation. So this was not just a piece of paperwork sitting in a file. It became one of the first official layers that other people could build from. It became part of the foundation. Not the whole case, not the final investigation, but one of the earliest official records that could influence what came next. But what if the written report was shaped by shock, or cognitive overload, or routine procedure, or an early theory formed before the full picture was clear? That does not automatically mean deception, but it does mean we should slow down, because before the clean legal narrative the public eventually hears, there is usually a messier beginning. Fragmented, emotional, incomplete. And chapter 1 is asking us to look at that beginning before it hardens into certainty. There is one moment in chapter 1 that almost feels like a cliffhanger, so let's start there. And it stood out to me immediately. After Nunez sees the scene, he appears to briefly consider whether one of the victims, Ethan, may have killed himself. And keep in mind, at this point, this was before they had discovered Kaylee and Maddie's bodies on the 3rd floor. So he is not yet looking at the full scope of the crime scene. He is looking at Ethan in the bed, dead, killed, and Zana on the floor, a very violent death. And this chapter does give us important context about Nunez himself. According to the author, Nunez was young, but he was not brand new to emergency scenes. He had been with the police department for about 2 years, had volunteered with the Moscow Fire Department before that, and had previously responded to a shooting where he provided life-saving measures to 2 gunshot victims, one of whom died. So I do not read this moment as simply inexperience, and I do not read it as proof of incompetence or bad faith. I read it as something more specific, a first responder trying to categorize an extraordinary scene before the full reality of it was known. And that is what makes the body cam so useful here. We're just not seeing the scene. We're watching the earliest thought process form in real time. Before the report, before the affidavit, before the plea narrative, before the clean version. We are watching the first attempt to make meaning. And then another officer basically asks him, "How did you get there?" In other words, what are you basing that on? And Nunez does not seem to have a clear answer yet. Instead, he says something along the lines of seeing blood. So that is a part I want to slow down on. Not because we should treat that early thought as fact, not because it proves what happened, and not because it means the officer was intentionally steering anything, but because we are watching the first officer try to make meaning in real time. He sees blood. He sees two people who appear deceased. He is standing inside a scene he did not expect to walk into. And his mind appears to reach for a category before the scene has been fully reconstructed. Was this a suicide? Was this a homicide? Was this an accident? Were there more victims? Was there still a threat inside the house? Was the scene secured? Those are not small questions. Those are the first frames. And in the earliest moments of an unthinkable scene, even someone with prior emergency exposure can still be operating with incomplete information. The mind still tries to organize chaos. It tries to name what it is seeing. It tries to make the impossible fit into some kind of recognizable pattern. But that is very different from a finished investigative conclusion. And that is why I keep coming back to this moment. Because even if an early theory is corrected later, the first frame can still shape what someone notices. It can shape what they ask. It can shape what they do not ask. And it can shape how the event gets written down afterward. So for me, the moment adds another layer to the first responder filter. Nunez was not only documenting the scene, but he was trying to understand what kind of scene it was. And that is a gap we have to keep paying attention to, because there is a major difference between a first officer trying to interpret chaos in real time and the clean version of events that later becomes an official story. And this is why this does not stay as just an interesting body cam moment, because in a case this large, the body cam was not going to disappear into the background. It was going to be reviewed, compared, measured against the written record. And later, the defense would challenge parts of Nunez's written account by pointing back to what the body cam appeared to show. So this becomes bigger than one officer having an early thought in a chaotic scene. It becomes a question of how the raw moment compares to the official version in the report. And that brings us to the next layer, the difference between the scene and the story. The body cam shows the scene. The report begins shaping the story. This is a part of chapter 1 that feels central to me, because the author is drawing a distinction between two very different layers, what the body cam appears to show and what Officer Nunez later wrote in his report. That distinction becomes the pressure point of the chapter, in my opinion, because most people are not going to go back and compare every line of a police report to every second of body cam footage, because they're just not. They are going to assume the report accurately captures what happened. And honestly, that is normal. A police report has authority. It feels official. It becomes part of the record. And once something becomes part of the record, it starts carrying a kind of weight that the raw moment itself may not have had yet. But if the body cam complicates the report, then the question is not automatically, did someone lie? The better question is, what changed between the scene and the written version of the scene? Was something simplified? Was something remembered differently? Was something written with more certainty than the moment itself actually had? Was something left out because, in real time, it did not seem as significant as it would later become? This is a pressure point for me, because the issue may be deception, but it may also be reliability, memory, shock, documentation, the limits of what one person could process while standing inside a catastrophic scene. And this is why the body cam becomes so useful here. Not because body cam is perfect, It is not, actually. It has angles. It has limits. It captures only what it captures. But it is still closer to the raw moment than the official version in the report. So when the body cam and the report do not fully line up, that is not where we jump straight to a conclusion. That is where we slow down, because that gap tells us something, not necessarily about guilt, not necessarily about motive, but about how a chaotic scene begins turning into an official story. And for me, that is the first real gap chapter 1 is asking us to look at. The gap between the scene and the story. And once we start looking at the gap between the scene and the story, another layer appears. Because the written record is not only shaped by what an officer sees, it is also shaped by what an officer is told. And in this case, one of the most important things Officer Nunez was told came from Dylan, one of the surviving roommates. So now the question becomes, how did the first official response handle her explanation? Did it test the explanation against the timeline? Did it separate trauma response from factual reconstruction? Or did it absorb the explanation into the early story before the full scene was understood? That is where chapter 1 moves from the physical scene into the way the surviving witness account entered the record. One of the most important parts of chapter 1 is not just what Dylan says, it is what happens after she says it. And I want to be extremely careful here. This is not about blaming Dylan, and it is not about pretending trauma responses are predictable. They are not. People freeze. People rationalize. People minimize. People try to explain away things that are too terrifying to fully process. So the question is not, why didn't Dylan act the way we think we would act? That is not the point. The question is, instead, how was her explanation handled in the first official response? According to the author, Dylan described hearing more than the public may have first understood. Sounds of struggle, screams. The disturbance was serious enough that Dylan and Bethany were reportedly calling the other roommates repeatedly. Immediately, it sounds like. And she also reportedly gave an explanation along the lines of not thinking something terrible had happened because nothing bad happens in Moscow. That phrase does a lot of work, not because it proves anything by itself, but because it functions like a frame. Nothing bad happens here is not just an explanation. It is a way of interpreting reality. It tells us the disturbing sounds, unanswered calls, fear, confusion, and even seeing something alarming may have been filtered through a belief that this kind of violence was unthinkable in that place. And emotionally, I can understand how a person might reach for that, because when something is too horrifying to process, the brain may try to make it smaller. It may try to say, that cannot be what it is. That does not happen here. That does not happen to people I know. That does not happen in my house. But there is another layer here, too, because the author does not present Dylan's explanation neutrally. He draws attention to how the explanation appears in the scene. He notes that Dylan's first words of explanation were about waking up at 4 a.m. And according to the author, this happens while Dylan and Bethany are outside the house with a larger group of friends. Dylan is speaking to Kaylee's ex-boyfriend, Jack, as Officer Nunez is walking toward her. And the author points out that Dylan appears to look directly at Nunez while saying it, that she woke up at 4 a.m. To me, the way the author puts this in the scene, to me, that feels intentional. The author seems to be asking us to notice not only the explanation itself, but the way that explanation enters the scene. Who is present? Who can hear it? And whether it is being spoken into the official space of the investigation. He also includes another detail that feels intentional, the emotional presentation. He describes Dylan as shifting between emotional states, hysterical, calm, crying, and that across 21 minutes of recorded crying, the author did not see what looked to him like a single visible tear. Now, again, I want to be careful with that. That does not prove she was lying. It does not prove she was acting. And it does not mean trauma has to look a certain way. But as a narrative detail, it does invite the reader to notice a possible gap between the emotional presentation, what was visibly on body cam, and the explanation being offered. So again, the point is not to diagnose Dylan from a distance. The point is to notice how Chapter 1 frames the moment. The author is not just reporting her explanation. He is drawing attention to timing, eye contact, emotional presentation, and what was or was not visible on body cam. But from an investigative standpoint, that entire explanation should have opened the door to deeper follow-up. Because once an officer is standing outside a house where something horrific clearly did happen, the safe town frame has already failed. And it was not only the safe town explanation that needed clarification, it was the entire cluster around it. The timing, the emotional presentation, the 4 a.m. explanation, what Dylan believes she heard, what she believes she saw, and how all of that fits with the delay before 911 was called. And this is where the timeline gets especially difficult to parse. Because according to the passage, Dylan appears to describe looking down the hall toward Xana's room and seeing Xana lying on the floor. But at that point, she says she thought Xana was sleeping. Then Dylan says she ran downstairs to Bethany's room, got into bed, and fell asleep. But the author points out that Nunez does not ask how the woman he had just seen on the second floor, someone who appeared to be the victim of extreme violence, could have been mistaken for sleeping. And that is the part that needed clarification. For instance, what exactly did Dylan see? How much could she see? What made her interpret it as sleeping? Was the lighting too poor to understand what she was looking at? Was this shock? Was it confusion? Was it rationalization? Those are very different possibilities, but the distinction should have been clarified before that explanation became part of the first official record. So the question becomes, if someone heard disturbing sounds, could not reach the roommates, looked toward Xana's room, thought she saw Xana sleeping on the floor, went into Bethany's room and fell asleep, later woke up and still could not get anyone to answer. And by the way, when she saw Xana on the floor, it was about 4 a.m. before she ran down to Bethany's room. She later woke up and still could not get anyone to answer, contacted Emily, her friend, after which Emily and Hunter became part of the morning response. And the 911 call still did not happen until much later. How was that explanation tested? Not because trauma responses are predictable, they are not. Not because this proves deception, does not. But because trauma response and timeline reconstruction are two different things. And in Chapter 1, that distinction feels critical. Another thing that stands out in Chapter 1 is the way Officer Nunez appears to move through routine information. While he's questioning Dylan, he's getting basic details, administrative information, birthdays, names, spellings, things like that, the kinds of things officers gather when they are building a report. And in an ordinary situation, that might make perfect sense. But this was not ordinary. This was not a noise complaint. This was not a confused welfare check that turned out to be nothing. This was a horrific scene. And according to the author, Nunez did not appear to press Dylan very far in that moment. At least from the way the chapter presents it, there were obvious follow-up areas that seemed to remain unclear. For instance, the delay before 911 was called. What Dylan understood she heard. What Dylan understood she saw. The difference between looking toward Xana's room around 4:20 a.m. and later describing seeing her friend before calling Hunter. The meaning of the 4 a.m. wake-up explanation. When fear first entered the timeline. And what happened between those early morning moments and the eventual 911 call. Those are not questions I am claiming the book lists one by one. They are the questions the situation appears to invite once the chapter lays out the body cam, the written report, and Dylan's explanation. And again, I want to be careful. I'm not saying that to attack Nunez, and I am not saying that to attack Dylan. I am saying it because this is where early narratives can start forming before anyone realizes they are forming. Because if the first officer is shocked, overwhelmed, and moving through a routine procedure, then important contradictions can be recorded without being fully examined. The timeline can be written down without being fully tested. A witness explanation can be preserved without being fully clarified. And a moment that should have opened into deeper questioning can become part of the official record almost as is. That is a concern I keep coming back to here. Because sometimes the problem is not one dramatic act of deception. Sometimes the problem is smaller than that, quieter than that, more procedural than that. It is the moment when ordinary report gathering meets an extraordinary scene. And the routine keeps moving, even though the facts are asking for a pause. So for me, this is not about saying Officer Nunez should have had the entire case solved in the first response. That would be unfair. He was not standing there with the benefit of hindsight. But it is fair to ask whether the first official response clarified the parts that did not make sense. Because once those details are written down, they do not stay neutral. They become part of the foundation. And if the foundation contains untested assumptions, unclear explanations, or areas that were not clarified early enough, then everything built on top of that foundation deserves a closer look. And that is where all of these threads come together. The first theory, the body cam, the written report, the witness explanation, the routine questions that were asked, and the follow-up questions that may not have been asked. Individually, each one might look small, but together they raise the larger issue Chapter 1 keeps circling back to. What happens when the first official record is created before the scene has been fully understood? Small, early gaps can ripple forward, and this is why early records matter. Because if the report becomes the foundation, then even a small gap at the beginning can ripple forward. That is the butterfly effect coming full circle. Not in a mystical way, in a procedural way. One early assumption, one untested explanation, one missing follow-up question, one written report that carries more certainty than the moment itself may have had. Any of those can become more important later if future steps begin building on them. And that is why I want to be very clear here. I am not saying Officer Nunez intentionally misled anyone. I am not saying Dylan did something wrong. I am not saying this proves a conspiracy. And I am not saying the author's framing should be accepted without question either. Because the book is also framing. The author is also choosing what to emphasize, what to contrast, and how to arrange the information. So the point is not to replace one unquestioned narrative with another. The point is to slow down and compare the layers. The body cam layer, the written report layer, the author's layer, and eventually the legal narrative that reaches the public. And near the end of Chapter 1, the author brings those layers together. He writes that Nunez captured the initial condition of the scene in audio and video, but also filed a written report. And in that paperwork, the author says, things seem to fall apart. But then he goes further. The author says that because other steps were taken based on the paper report, the seeming mistakes may have been compounded as additional agencies joined the investigation. And that is where the butterfly effect comes back in. Small mistakes at the beginning can snowball into outcomes no one could have predicted. That is what Chapter 1 is asking us to pay attention to, because it raises a serious pattern question. What happens when the first official version of a horrific event is created by someone who may still be trying to understand what he walked into. And what happens when that first official version does not fully match the body cam? That is where we have to slow down, because legal narratives often sound clean by the time they reach the public. But early reality is rarely clean. It is fragmented, chaotic, emotional, incomplete. And sometimes the first official record may carry more confidence than the moment itself actually had. So when we are looking at chapter 1, I do not think the responsible move is to jump straight to blame. But I also do not think the responsible move is to ignore the gap. The responsible move is to hold both truths at the same time. A first responder can be overwhelmed and acting in good faith. And the record he creates can still need serious scrutiny. That is the space this chapter lives in. So for me, chapter 1 is not just about the crime scene. It is about the beginning of the story-making process. The author starts with the butterfly effect because he's asking us to look at the first flap, the first moment where something small, early, and official may have shaped everything that came after. The call was for an unconscious person. The scene was something much worse. The body cam captured one layer. The report created another. The first officer appears to be trying to make meaning in real time. The surviving roommate's explanation appears to raise follow-up questions. And the public narrative would eventually be built through reports, summaries, filings, press coverage, and finally, a plea. That is why this first chapter deserves close attention. Because before we ever get to courtroom certainty, we start with something much messier. A first responder, a shocking scene, a surviving witness, a written report that may not fully match the footage, and a case where the final legal outcome gave the public a version of certainty before every question had been fully answered. That is the first gap between the scene and the story. And that is a gap I'm going to keep watching as this book unfolds. I'm going to keep going chapter by chapter, and I'm going to keep doing it this way, carefully, slowly, without reading ahead, and without forcing conclusions the chapter itself has not earned yet. So let me know what stood out to you from chapter 1. Do you see this as a documentation problem necessarily? A shock problem? An investigative follow-up problem, maybe? Do you see this as an author framing problem or something else entirely? And if you want to follow this breakdown as I read through the book, make sure you subscribe, because this is going to be an ongoing series from beginning to end, chapters 1 through the end. Because in this case, I don't think the important question is only what happened. I think the question is also, how did the story become the story? So, thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you hopefully for chapter 2.